Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome to an impromptu episode of the Human Risk podcast. Now, next month, I was due to be meeting in Paris with two other people that have separately appeared on the podcast before. Richard Bistrong, Ruth Steinholtz and I were due at an ethics conference in Paris. Now, that, in common with many other events, has been cancelled and turned into an online gathering. And the three of us were having a conversation about the ethics of organising conferences and meetings at a time like this. The conversation took us to some interesting spaces, so we thought we'd record a podcast episode all about it. So here are Richard, Ruth, and I in conversation about the ethics of running events at a time like this.
So, Christian, thank you for the intro. It's great to be virtually chatting with you and Ruth today. And what I was thinking, being that we were all supposed to be together in a few weeks and now we're not because an event was canceled, what are the, for lack of a better term, what are the ethics about attending ethics events right now? And from a behavioral perspective and a risk perspective, Christian and Ruth, what are some of the things that might impact our decision-making that might get in between the way we want to behave in this environment and the way we're actually behaving? So I'm really interested to sort of banter about this topic a bit.
Excellent. Richard, I have had several experiences where this has really come up. So I'm quite happy to be here to talk to both you and Christian about this. I think it's a new thing in a way that everybody's going to have to start thinking about quite seriously over the next weeks and potentially months. So I think this is a good time to start talking about it.
You know, we've seen so many of these things. And one of the things I think is interesting is there have been people that have gone, we're just not going to do this and we'll bite the bullet early. And then we've had other events that we've seen where, you know, it takes people a little bit longer. And I think it's quite challenging when you've spent time and effort building something up. And part of the reason of getting people together is so that they can network around the event. To have to kind of unpick that, you know, to your point, Richard, is quite a big challenge, I think. And I can understand why people are reluctant to cancel something that they've put a heck of a lot of effort into organizing.
And that goes to something that we talk about in our ethics and compliance world. Sunk cost bias, I think it's what it's often referred to. You know, when we have air tickets that are booked and we have meetings that are set up and we've maybe prepaid hotels and we've done all this planning around an event, and as we get close to the finish line to attend a conference, are we less likely to course correct or to reevaluate our decisions because we've put so much time and effort into attending a particular conference? What are your perspectives on that?
Look, I think undoubtedly, the closer you get to it being, it's a natural human tendency, right? We you know, you put a lot of effort into something, you've spent money on something, it makes it a lot harder to kind of cancel or to pull back from it. And I think, you know, that's a natural human tendency that applies in all sorts of different contexts, but we can see it applying here. And you can see sort of organizers getting nervous around events and you know, they've got a lot on the line. You've got participants have a lot on the line. And of course, the issue here around a lot of these conferences is that we're dealing with an unknown. I don't know what might happen if we go ahead, but I know what will happen if we don't, which is that, you know, I don't have an event to talk about. I've incurred a load of costs. And so you're dealing with a whole load of conflicting emotions where we're probably not good as human beings at judging different outcomes. And we're not good at thinking beyond the basic kind of computations that we make around the world as we see it.
And that actually goes back to the sort of topic of our podcast, because it's also a question of what sort of decision people think they're making. Are they looking at the sort of risk benefit, how much money they might lose, et cetera, or are they thinking of it as an ethical question? Because if you just look at it in terms of money, you might decide, well, you know, obviously we have to go ahead because we have all of this invested in it. But that then leads you to ignore the fact that you might be doing something that could cause the death of people or persons unknown even by doing that. And I think that's where, I had an interesting reaction yesterday. I was talking with a client. I'm supposed to be going to one of their European offices next week to run a workshop. And I raised this with the head of the client, and his reaction was, we have a duty of care to you. And by the way, I'm just a consultant. I'm not an employee. And if you don't feel comfortable going, then, there is absolutely no problem. And I suggested we redo it as a virtual event, which is we're now in the process of doing. But it was interesting that his reaction was immediately, we have a duty of care, rather than, well, how much money are you going to have to, are we going to lose because we've already paid for your airfare, et cetera.
Which is interesting, Ruth, and it's my perception, generally speaking, to what you just spoke about, is that the multinational perspective on this is, I think, far more like forward thinking and duty of care thinking, where sort of the conferences are lagging a little bit behind, where multinationals, I had an event right here in the US this week that was also being hosted at a client where, as they say, workplace safety is in our DNA. And they were like, to bring in people externally and to maybe expose you, or if you're not well, to potentially expose people internally. It's not such a critical meeting that it just can't be, we can't kick that can down the road a little bit. So I've been impressed by some of the multinational responses to this as being very, as you well said, duty of care focused.
I was going to say, it's interesting, right? Because if you were organizing an event in a war zone, right, suddenly the place that you chosen turned out to become a war zone, there would be no question, right? You wouldn't do it. And yet, because of the nature of this particular thing, there seems to be a different set of thought processes that are entered into. And the bit that sort of struck me is around, there's a lot of people waiting for governments or global organizations like the World Health Organization to tell them what to do. And so we won't decide to do anything until we're told to by those authorities. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic, that you get a lot of companies who run their business, we'll react to it when the regulators tell us to react to it. And of course, as we know, these governmental bodies tend to come to things late. And so I think there's a really interesting abdication of responsibility piece, because, which wouldn't happen, as I say, if there was a war zone or an incident, but does happen because there's this kind of nebulousness around it and it's not a visible thing. So I can defer my responsibility. I'll wait till the authorities tell me I shouldn't host it, rather than grabbing the initiative. And then, of course, if you then have to cancel as a result of it, it's obvious to everybody that you've done it because of the authorities, not because you thought it was the right thing.
Yeah, so somebody else is responsible. I think the other thing that reflects is a question of whose values and how strong values are. And as Richard said, if a company has values around employee safety, health and safety, well-being, etc., that should immediately cause them to think about whether non-essential meetings need to go ahead, and how to protect people who do have to go into work without waiting for any government or any other organization to tell them that they have to do it. I think the other thing is that kind of touches on is, the risk may be different for different people. It shouldn't have to be up to individual employees, for example, to say, well, I live with somebody with asthma, or my parents live in my house and they're over 80, things like that. On whose shoulders does the responsibility of protecting people fall in an organization?
That's a good point. And I think the element that Christian raised is one that's worth pondering is it easier for us to abdicate personal responsibility to a third party? So I had the pleasure of seeing Christian not too long ago in London, and we were talking about some of the initial conference organizers that were still proceeding were pivoting on Health Organization recommendation saying this is what the WHO says or what a national authority said. So if it's good enough for them, it's essentially good enough for us. And are we sort of abdicating our own duty for care, for ourselves to make smart, decisions with respect to our health, welfare, and safety? And, Christian, from your human risk perspective, is that something that we often see where individuals will just defer to a third party and say, well, I don't have to stress out about this decision as to a yes or no because someone's essentially made it for me?
There's a very legalistic thing here, right, which says, not the authorities have said we can, but if the authorities haven't said we can't, we're good to go because that's defensible. We will get ourselves out of legal trouble if we stick to that line. And there's probably contracts that pin off that and force majeure clauses and all those sorts of things. But actually, I think that it may pass a technically legal test, but it fails a kind of emotional, ethical test, which sort of says everybody can, back to my point, everybody can see what you're doing. And this idea, I think, that you defer to some further authority on a topic where you probably really ought to have a view yourself, I think it sort of feels good in the moment, but I think is going to be found wanting longer term because everybody knows that it's not a case of you sit there and wait for the authorities to tell you not to do something. You have a choice. And at each day that goes by, you have a choice as to whether you proceed or don't proceed. And so the idea that you don't have a choice in these things because you're legally bound until such time as the authorities tell you can't, I think is, technically correct, but is practically flawed. And I see a heck of a lot of this going on where it's just easier to point to something else and lawyers love it because it's defensible, but it really fails a whole load of other tests.
Yeah, I think the force majeure point, lawyers do often, of course, look at, the CEO will come in and say, is this a case of force majeure, which will excuse our performance? And it essentially what they're asking is a financial question, economic question. Because if it's force majeure, then you wouldn't have to pay the penalty or you wouldn't, whatever. But I think that a good lawyer, certainly a good in-house counsel, would say the answer is, whatever the answer is legally, the answer is that ethically this is not the right thing to do. But these are but they would then really be duty bound to say to the CEO, these are the consequences. You may have to pay the penalty under the contract or whatever. And then it also gets into a conversation between two companies where maybe the companies need to work out an ethical division of the consequences, or is one party going to stick to the contract and force the other into paying all the damages? I think there's another aspect of this which plays into all of this decision making, and that is people are also evaluating the risk differently and behaving differently in accordance with that evaluation. So there are still people who are not washing their hands, who are coughing in public, who are attending meetings when perhaps they know they shouldn't. There's something ultimately which we might want to talk about in another podcast about the ethics of what happened in Italy when people tried to get out of the lockdown zone because CNN leaked the plan. But by the way, a lot of people also drove back into the lockdown zone because they were away at their weekend ski places or at the ocean. So, there were people doing the right thing and people doing the wrong thing in Italy. I don't think we should stigmatize them. But there are a lot of people who are not actually doing what is recommended, and that means that they are putting other people at risk. And so how do you deal with that from a human risk perspective?
Judging other people is really tough because on the face of it, we all have our own individual priorities and so I can sort of say it's very, for some people, it's very easy to do the right thing. Because, if I take myself, for example, I happen to work for myself, I can make strategic decisions about my company's direction that I can trumpet very loudly if I wanted to, which are much more challenging if you have employees in a range of other pieces. But I think what I think is interesting is we're seeing some really good role models. And I never thought I would say this, but Pearl Jam, the band from Seattle, so they are, Seattle's an area there's been quite a lot of infections. They have cancelled their tour and just effectively said, we don't want to do this, but we recognize it's the right thing to do and we don't want to put you in danger. And I'm sure that's costing them a ton of money. That for me is like role model behavior. Whereas you see other artists and sports is an interesting one where I'm seeing this happening quite a bit where, there's some countries where they've cancelled everything or they're performing behind closed doors. And you've got others, England being a good example, where there's this reluctance to cancel and you kind of know it's coming. And I think there's nothing worse than coming late to the party. Doing the right thing involves doing the right thing right now. Just, looking like you've cancelled something at the 11th hour doesn't feel like you're doing it voluntarily for the right reasons.
No.
I agree with that. And I think what's fascinating about this, because there's a lot in our ethics and compliance world now about profit and purpose, right? ESG and CSR is, a lot of the ethics and compliance and risk conferences, those are for-profit enterprises, right? They're in the events business. And we've seen this, the Geneva Auto Show. I mean, events are not exclusive to ethics and compliance. But it's interesting to watch organizations that are continuing to promote gatherings, whether they're local or regional or international, during this time of uncertainty. So, within our own sort of concentric circles, there's an ethical dilemma here. Should we be having ethics get-togethers at all until we have more information and we're sort of settled down on this issue? So it's almost like a dilemma wrapped in a dilemma.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good point. I actually made the point, for example, that with a client that we should go ahead virtually. And then there was this point of, well, we've said how important this was. It's around values. So we've said how important it is. If we now tell people not to come, what does that say? Well, what it says is that our values are really important, that we believe we shouldn't do this in person. We should do it virtually. The other interesting thing is that people are reacting in one of two ways. Some people are seeing this as an opportunity to innovate ways of having meetings because they realize that, this in a way is the future. Virtual meetings are going to increase. If we want a sustainable world, we're going to have to fly less and have fewer in-person get-togethers. So I've had both reactions. People say, oh, this is a really good way for us to think about how we might do this in the future. And then I've had other people say, oh, that's in the too difficult box, can't cope. And I think the ones who are reacting with an open mind and saying, well, let's try it. Let's see how we can do this. Ultimately, probably their business will be better because they'll have figured out new ways of working.
And I think this is a really interesting ethical stress test. So we can start to see what people really believe in. And I recognize that for some businesses, if you're a small business and you are dependent on certain dynamics that are no longer exist, or even a big business, some of the airlines, for example, there's some real fundamental questions you've got to answer. And for some of them, profitability or survival is in question. So I think in those situations, I think it's a bit more challenging. But I think for a lot of other people, you can sort of see what really matters to you and how are you behaving. And I'm finding it really intriguing looking at my own personal arrangements. If I have to cancel flights or hotels, I am, of course, even if those things were not refundable, I'm going to try and phone the organization and say, can we come to some arrangement? And I think that requires a bit of understanding from me as well. So, one of the things I'm saying is look, okay, in many cases, it's places I would go to anyway. So can we perhaps rather than refunding me, defer that for another stay, right? So a bit of give and take on both sides. But I think we're seeing a load of organizations who are not responding in the right way. If the theory about ethics is right, that to have a sustainable business, you need to behave in ethics, we're going to see some interesting behaviors afterwards because people are going to remember when they got screwed over by companies playing to the law and not respecting the reality situation. And I think people will remember those businesses that behaved and saw this thing through in a way that others didn't.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I'm going to have to talk to both KLM and BA, and it's going to be interesting to see if either one of them are flexible. I did recently just talk to a hotel chain where I had a non-refundable reservation, and the answer was somebody else could use it, or you can defer it for 3 months. So, they have changed, in that case, they changed their policy, because theoretically it was completely non-refundable. Eurostar, you can change the date. So I've changed the date till September, thinking by then I don't know if I'll need to go to that place in September, but otherwise I would entirely lose the booking.
And there was an article in the FT not too long ago that pivots on what you just shared and it was talking about CEO decision making right now. People are going to remember policy changes that CEOs decide to make now in the difficult times. Our memories are going to be long, right, as to what organizations do right now, not during the good times, but, when we're facing a struggle. So, this is a challenging time, and there's no quick solutions here, but I think we talked about a few things that might impact our decision making, like abdicating responsibility for our own health, safety, and welfare onto third parties, and also, being aware of sunk cost bias. It was not easy for me. I'm supposed to be leaving in 3 days to go back to Europe. I had a lot of plans and a lot going on, and I struggled with the decision to cancel that. This is not easy. And I think that when we surface some of these unknowns, hopefully we can at least pick up the dust a little bit as to what we should be thinking about during these challenging times.
Yeah, I have one final thought. So I think that this is a very good time for companies to be reflecting on values, because the fact of facing one's mortality, which to a certain extent, presumably a lot of people this has raised the thoughts of, well, what happens if I get ill? It will probably mean that a lot more people are thinking about what's really important to me. So I think this is a really good time to have conversations around values in one's organization.
And look, I think we'll leave the conversation there. It goes without saying, of course, that given we have now all cancelled travel to various places, if people need us on their virtual replacements, we would, of course, be delighted to assist with that. And I will put contact details for everybody in the show notes. But Ruth and Richard, thank you for joining me on this impromptu version of the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian.